Imagine, imagine for a second, you're commanding 80,000 heavily armed, highly trained troops.
Right. A massive force.
Exactly. You've just fought this grueling battle, and you've captured the enemy's capital city. Your flag is flying over the stronghold.
Classic victory.
Yeah. By every traditional metric of human warfare, you have won. But then you wake up the next morning, and your biggest threat isn't, an enemy Chenk battalion.
Oh, not at all.
Your biggest threat is figuring out how to repair a 4,000-line telephone exchange. Or, like, how to deliver the morning mail.
Yeah, or running a high school chemistry exam in a literal war zone.
Right. All while your own government might secretly be arming the exact people trying to kill you.
It is the absolute terrifying illusion of victory. You think you've reached the end of the game only to realize the board just got flipped over.
Yeah.
The rules evaporate and you're suddenly playing something entirely different.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking you right into the heart of one of the most honestly complex and paradoxical moments in modern military history.
It really is.
We've been poring over the historical records, after-action reports, and deep analyses of the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF.
And specifically their operations in Sri Lanka during the late 1980s.
Right. And for this deep dive, we are putting you, the listener, firmly in the shoes of a military historian and a counterinsurgency analyst. We're looking at the immediate aftermath of a massive conventional battle.
Because our mission today is to look at the mechanics of this conflict, to answer one really massive overarching question.
Which is?
Why does defeating an opponent militarily, just completely beating them on the battlefield, not automatically end a war?
Yeah, because you look at the late autumn of 1987, the IPKF has just captured Jaffna. That was the primary stronghold of the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam.
Right, the Tigers.
And just for some quick context, for anyone not deeply familiar with the geopolitics of that era, we're just looking at the historical record here. The Indian military was in Sri Lanka at the invitation of the Sri Lankan government.
Yes, enforcing the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord.
Exactly. They were essentially trying to disarm militant groups, enforce a peace agreement between the Sinhalese-dominated government and the Tamil minority fighting for a separate state. So the IPKF goes in, and they take Jaffna, they took the territory.
The conflict didn't end.
Not at all.
Yeah.
If anything, it mutated. So let's unpack this right at the start. Why does capturing the capital not equal a conclusion?
Because we have to understand the fundamental anatomy of an insurgency. It is an entirely different organism than a conventional army.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about a conventional military force. It's heavy, it needs territory to exist, it needs open supply lines, massive depots, and usually a political capital to defend.
Right, something to hold on to.
Exactly. If you take those away, the army starves and it collapses. But an insurgency does not need to hold a single city to survive. It survives through alternative lifebloods.
Because it's decentralized by design.
Completely. It needs population support, first and foremost. It needs favorable terrain to hide in, dense jungles or mountains.
Yeah.
It needs a unifying ideology that transcends physical borders, a clandestine underground organization, and, crucially, external support from outside the immediate conflict zone.
So, when the IPKF captured Jaffna, they didn't defeat the LTTE.
No, they simply pushed them out of the urban environment and forced them to trigger their next evolutionary phase.
And the historical analysis of this specific moment highlights a massive doctrinal shift. It's this transition from focusing on the military center of gravity to the insurgency center of gravity. I think we really need to define those terms for the listener because it kind of dictates everything that happens next.
Yeah, it's a concept that dates back to Karl von Clausewitz, the famous military theorist. The center of gravity is basically the source of power that provides moral or physical strength.
Freedom of action.
Right, or the will to act. If you destroy the enemy's center of gravity, you break their ability to resist. In a conventional state-on-state war, the military center of gravity is usually the enemy's armed forces or their capital city.
So you destroy the army, you occupy the capital, you win.
Precisely.
Like World War II. You take Berlin, the war in Europe ends.
Exactly. But in an insurgency, the center of gravity shifts completely.
Yeah.
The enemy army isn't the target anymore because, the enemy army is invisible.
Right.
The new center of gravity becomes the population itself. Controlling, influencing, and ultimately winning over the people becomes the ultimate objective. As the old Maoist doctrine goes, the people are the water that the insurgent fish swim in.
And if you want to catch the fish, you have to control the water.
You have to control the water.
Okay, let's see if I can visualize this. Winning a conventional war is like winning a boxing match in a ring.
Okay, I like that.
There are ropes, there are rules. You can clearly see your opponent standing across from you, and when you knock them to the canvas, the referee raises your hand and it's over.
Right.
But fighting an insurgency that is like playing a deadly, sprawling game of hide-and-seek in an endless, dark forest. There is no referee, and the millions of people living in that forest get to take a vote on who actually wins.
That is exactly the dynamic, and it brings us right to the IPKF's brutal transition. They had just won the boxing match in Jaffna, but the LTTE didn't surrender.
They just climbed out of the ring.
They climbed out, ran into the endless forest, specifically the dense jungles of the Van region, set up hidden camps, regrouped, and started playing hide-and-seek.
So how exactly does a massive conventional army pivot from the boxing ring to the forest? I mean, armies are built for the ring. They're built with main battle tanks, heavy artillery, and massive troop formations designed to meet other massive troop formations.
Yeah. And that, right there, was the profound institutional challenge facing the Indian commanders on the ground. The immediate post-capture transformation was a total shock to the system.
Yeah.
The shift in the style of warfare was incredibly stark. Think about the days leading up to the fall of Jaffna. You had urban battles, house-to-house clearing, fixed enemy positions, direct kinetic confrontation.
Right, you could point your rifle in a direction and know the threat was there.
Yes. But after Jaffna fell, the entire reality of the combat zone inverted. The LTTE melted away. Suddenly, the IPKF was dealing with hit-and-run attacks, ambushes from the dense tree line, improvised explosive devices, IEDs buried in the dirt roads.
Oh.
And perhaps most damaging of all, a massive escalation in information warfare and psychological operations. The IPKF, this massive conventional force, had to rapidly transition its entire institutional mindset, its training, and its deployment strategy completely on the fly.
And the military strategy developed for this new phase is often described in the sources as a two-front war. But we aren't talking about two geographic fronts, right? It's not like fighting in the north and the south simultaneously.
No. We are talking about two conceptual fronts that have to be fought at the exact same time. The commanders realized that from this point forward, the battle had to be waged simultaneously on the military front and the political front.
Let's break those down. What does the military front actually look like when the enemy is hiding in the jungle?
Well, the military front in this phase is entirely about unrelenting, suffocating pressure. The IPKF had to mount continuous search and destroy operations and establish what military planners call area domination.
Okay.
The goal here isn't necessarily a war of annihilation. It is almost impossible to wipe out every single insurgent in a dense tropical jungle where they know every trail and cave.
Right, you can't find them all.
Exactly. The goal is to apply so much kinetic pressure to disrupt their camps and supply lines so thoroughly that the insurgents are forced to the negotiating table because survival in the bush is just no longer viable.
Okay, that makes sense. It's the stick. And what about the political front?
The political front is the carrot, but it's also the foundation of the entire strategy. It's about establishing governance, conducting negotiations, and building public confidence. It's about finding a legitimate political solution to the root ethnic and social causes of the conflict that led to the insurgency in the first place.
I have to play devil's advocate here because if I'm looking at this purely from a logistics and force projection standpoint, you have a military force of roughly 80,000 highly trained personnel. You have helicopters, armor, unlimited ammunition compared to the insurgents.
Massive overmatch, yeah.
Right. If you have that kind of overwhelming firepower, why are both fronts strictly necessary? Why couldn't a superior military force just squeeze the insurgents out through sheer attrition, just hunt them down tree by tree until they give up? Why do you have to do the messy political stuff?
It's a fundamental question, and honestly, history is littered with the ruins of empires that tried exactly that and failed catastrophically.
Wow, okay.
The reason both are strictly required is that military pressure without a political solution creates a vacuum. Let's say you take your 80,000 troops and you sweep a jungle province perfectly. You kill or capture every single active insurgent. The area is clean.
Okay.
But if you don't replace their influence with a functioning, trusted local political authority, what happens the moment your troops pack up and leave?
A new group of teenagers just picks up the rifles the old guys dropped because they are still angry about the exact same things.
Precisely. The underlying grievances haven't been solved. The military action, no matter how successful, only buys time and space. That is a golden rule of counterinsurgency. The military cannot solve the problem. It can only secure the environment so that a political solution can take root.
They just buy the window of opportunity.
Exactly. The troops provide the security umbrella so that elections can happen safely, so that civilian governance can function without fear of assassination, and so that the population feels safe enough to actively reject the insurgency.
So to execute this two-front war, to actually win over that center of gravity, we talked about the population. The military had to do something it had virtually no practical experience doing. They couldn't just patrol the streets. They had to actively run a city.
They did. And a governance vacuum is an insurgent's best friend. When the LTTE lost control of Jaffna, the administrative apparatus completely collapsed. Their civil administrators, the people running the courts and the local services, they either died in the fighting or fled into the jungles with the fighters.
And we really need to emphasize the scale here. Jaffna was not some tiny remote village. The records show the peninsula had a population of roughly 1 million people.
Yes, 1 million.
Plus, there were over 70,000 internally displaced persons who had fled the fighting and were sheltering in temples and schools. And suddenly, overnight, this metropolis is completely without an administrator. No police force, no utilities, no trash collection, no food distribution, absolute zero.
And the IPKF was literally the only organized, disciplined force left on the ground capable of stepping into that void. So civil affairs, which, let's be honest, an infantry battalion is not explicitly trained for,
Definitely not.
became their primary strategic weapon.
There is a specific figure from the history that really humanizes the suddenness of this shift. Brigadier R.I.S. Kalan. He was a senior Indian Army officer who was actually attending a prestigious academic course at the National Defense College in New Delhi.
Right in the middle of his studies.
Yeah, he gets pulled prematurely from his course, put on a plane, and appointed as the Town Commandant Jaffna, or TCJ. He arrives just as the city is falling, attached to the headquarters of the 54 Infantry Division, and he basically has to invent a job that did not exist a week prior.
Try to put yourself in his boots for a minute. You are a career military officer. Your expertise is in tactics, logistics, leading troops into battle. And suddenly someone hands you the keys to a ruined city of 1 million people in an active war zone and says, "Congratulations, you are now the mayor, the chief of police, the head of the water board, and the superintendent of schools. Fix it."
It's wild. Let's actually unpack the astonishing scope of what Brigadier Kalan and the IPKF had to do from scratch. Because this wasn't just humanitarian aid for the sake of feeling good. This was a calculated, strategic imperative to deny the insurgents a foothold in the minds of the people. Let's start with the most basic human need, food and supply. The local cooperative societies, the grocery stores, they were completely empty.
Right. The supply chains were shattered. So massive food supplies started arriving from India via ships at the KKS jetty, which is a port area in the north. But having food at the port doesn't feed a starving family in the city center.
No.
The IPKF had to requisition and muster local transport trucks, vans, whatever, ran to move those supplies from the jetty to Jaffna town. And remember the context. The war wasn't over. The LTTE had melted away, which meant they were risking ambushes, IEDs, and sniper fire every single time they moved a convoy of rice and lentils down those roads.
And they were distributing this food alongside the Red Cross just to keep the population from starving. And eventually, the Sri Lankan government supplies started reaching them by sea and land once the major arteries were secured and the local shops slowly started filling up again. But the refugee camps, those 70,000 displaced people, they still relied entirely on free military supplies.
And food was only half the biological equation. The medical situation was catastrophic.
The local hospital staff had largely fled. So the Indian Army Medical Corps, the AMC, had to step in and become the healthcare system for 1 million people. They reopened the civilian hospitals. Military technicians were in the operating rooms repairing vital medical equipment that had been damaged in the fighting.
Yeah.
They were even feeding the civilian patients out of the IPKF's own military rations until the local doctors and nurses eventually felt safe enough to return to work. But there is a fascinating twist in the intelligence records regarding this medical and food aid. What did the radio intercepts reveal?
This is a classic, agonizing counterinsurgency complication. The IPKF was actively intercepting LTTE radio communications in the jungle. Initially, right after Jaffna fell, the LTTE commanders were frantically complaining over the radio about severe shortages. They were out of food, out of antibiotics, out of bandages.
Makes sense.
But a few weeks into the IPKF's massive relief effort, those LTTE complaints over the radio suddenly started dying down. They weren't starving anymore.
Even though they were hiding in a jungle cut off from supply lines.
Exactly. The intelligence implication was immediate and clear. The food and the medicines that the IPKF and the NGOs were pumping into the refugee camps were quietly being siphoned off by LTTE sympathizers and smuggled straight out into the jungle to feed the insurgency.
That is the ultimate catch-22. It's maddening. You absolutely have to feed the population to win their hearts and minds, and just to fulfill your basic obligations under international law. But by feeding the population, you are inadvertently establishing a supply line that keeps the enemy fighters alive to shoot at your soldiers the next day.
It is the brutal friction of conducting civil affairs in a war zone. You cannot perfectly isolate the civilian from the insurgent. They share the same families, the same communities, the same geography.
Okay, so you're feeding them, you're treating their wounded. What about the infrastructure, the utilities?
Restoring electricity and water was vital not just for survival, but for the psychological return of normalcy. You can't run a hospital without power. You can't prevent cholera without clean water. The engineering regiments worked around the clock. But the communication infrastructure was an even more massive undertaking.
Oh, right, the phones.
Yeah, the IPKF engineers managed to commission a makeshift 200-line telephone exchange fairly quickly just to get the hospitals, the military command, and the remaining local officials talking to each other.
But the main city grid was dead. The local post and telegraph staff had to work with the military to repair a massive 4,000-line exchange that the LTTE had deliberately sabotaged and damaged during their retreat.
Now think about the strategic logic of that. Why would the LTTE, a group claiming to fight for the people of Jaffna, destroy the phone exchange of their own capital?
Because an isolated population is a terrified population. If you can't call your neighbor or the police or the hospital, you rely entirely on rumors. And rumors breed fear.
Exactly. By destroying communications, the LTTE maintained an information monopoly. They could spread propaganda about IPKF atrocities, and no one could verify it. By repairing that 4,000-line exchange, the IPKF wasn't just fixing wires, they were actively breaking the LTTE's grip on the local narrative.
It's astounding. The military is acting as a massive municipal government, a utility company, and a hospital board simultaneously, under the constant threat of violence. And if you look at the miscellaneous task they took on, it borders on the surreal. They delivered the civilian mail, they reopened the commercial banks. There is a note in the archives that they actually organized the return of civilian gold jewelry.
Oh, the pawned gold, yes.
Locals had pawned their gold between 1983 and 1986, and the banks had moved it all to Colombo in the south for safety during the war. The IPKF literally organized armed convoys to bring the people's pawned gold back to them.
Because returning personal wealth is a massive indicator of returning stability. They also recommenced the local bus services. They provided the petrol and diesel to keep the city moving. But again, the friction. They had to create an incredibly strict rationing and screening system to ensure that the fuel they provided didn't quietly end up in LTTE vehicles being used for car bombs.
And my absolute favorite detail, the one that truly shows how bizarre counterinsurgency is, education. They facilitated the postponement of the Class X exams, the major high school exams, from December 1987 to July 1988. The military literally transported the question papers under armed guard and had to actively persuade terrified teachers and children to actually show up to the school buildings to take their exams.
Holding high school chemistry and math exams in a combat zone, it sounds absurd, but nothing says the government is back in control, quite like a standardized test.
They also allowed the fishermen back out to sea. This was the primary livelihood for thousands of people along the coast. But to do that, the military had to explicitly accept the risk that the LTTE might, and almost certainly would, use those civilian fishing boats to smuggle weapons or move fighters. It is this constant, agonizing balancing act. You are intentionally risking your own military security in order to rebuild civil normalcy.
The burden was immense. Eventually, Brigadier Collins' office was augmented. The Indian government sent 3 Indian Administrative Service officers, IAS officers, specifically from the Tamil Nadu cadre, so they spoke the language and understood the cultural nuances perfectly.
That helps a lot.
It did. They also brought in a battalion of the Central Reserve Police Force, the CRPF, which crucially included a women's wing to handle female civilians and suspects appropriately. This influx of civilian administrative and policing expertise took the edge off the military occupation. It streamlined the process and, remarkably, earned genuine accolades from the local population for restoring order.
So providing water, holding exams, running the banks, returning the gold, this keeps people alive, and it restores a baseline of order. But how do you cross the bridge from tolerated occupier to trusted authority? How do you actually win their loyalty? How do you convince a Tamil population to actively turn away from a Tamil insurgency that has spent years claiming to be their sole protector?
That requires a targeted psychological strategy. And that brings us to the concept of WHAM, information dominance, and refugee management.
Wham! Winning hearts and minds. It sounds a bit like a corporate buzzword, but the historical analysis outlines a deeply sophisticated psychology and strategy behind it. And the biggest game changer wasn't handing out candy to children or building a new well. It was how they handled their enemies. It was the treatment of prisoners.
This is a crucial analytical point for understanding counterinsurgency. If you want to dry up an insurgency's recruiting pool, you have to fundamentally change how the population views your authority and your morality. When the IPKF captured suspected militants, they didn't just throw them in a dark subterranean prison and throw away the key. They placed them in specialized rehabilitation centers under tight security.
And they developed a very specific triage-like screening process. They categorized every detainee into 3 groups: black, gray, and white.
Yes. The black category was for hardcore confirmed LTTE insurgents. The gray category was for suspected insurgents or sympathizers where the evidence was ambiguous. And white was for civilians who had been caught up in the dragnet but were innocent.
Makes sense.
If an individual was categorized as white, they were immediately released back to their communities. For the black and gray detainees, the treatment within the centers was strictly, deliberately humanitarian.
They weren't subjected to harsh interrogations or punitive labor. They were actually provided with vocational training: carpentry, electrical work, mechanics. But the most important policy decision, the one that paid massive strategic dividends, was that their families were allowed to visit them.
Why do you think that family contact was so pivotal to the overall war effort?
Well, because it shattered the insurgent propaganda matrix. The LTTE commanders in the jungle were undoubtedly telling their young fighters, whatever you do, do not surrender. If the IPKF captures you, you will be tortured, you will be starved, and you will be executed. It's how you maintain fighting discipline in a losing battle.
Exactly.
But when mothers and sisters visited these rehabilitation centers and they saw their sons and brothers being treated humanely, eating 3 meals a day, and learning how to fix a radio hen, they went back to their villages with an entirely new narrative.
Yes, it was a truth virus. The historical records note that this policy directly led to relatives actively venturing out into the jungles, finding their family members who were still serving with the LTTE, and begging them to surrender. The families themselves became the IPKF's most effective psychological weapon because the fighters trusted their mothers when they said, "It's safe to give up."
It's like strategic judo.
Yeah.
You use the enemy's own family ties and social cohesion against their military structure, and building on that trust, the IPKF set up something called grievance cells.
Yeah, these were essentially open-door offices established across the region where the local populace could come to get local civil matters resolved, property disputes, missing persons. But very importantly, they were places where citizens were encouraged to report any cases of indiscipline, theft, or excesses committed by IPKF troops themselves.
I want to pause on that because that takes an immense amount of institutional confidence. You are an occupying military force, and you are actively inviting the local population to come into your base and complain about your own soldiers.
It takes confidence, and it takes strict internal discipline to actually punish your own soldiers if the complaints are valid. But doing so builds an unbreakable foundation of public trust. It proves to the population that the IPKF is bound by the rule of law, unlike the insurgents who rule by fear. And this leads to the ultimate pivot.
The intel.
Yes. This hard-won trust eventually transformed the general population into the IPKF's most potent intelligence asset.
Right, because once the locals felt confident that the IPKF wouldn't just disappear the next day and leave them to the mercy of the LTTE, they started talking.
The intelligence dam broke. Locals started quietly approaching the IPKF and sharing high-value, actionable intelligence. They drew maps showing where LTTE weapons, ammunition dumps, and massive explosive caches were hidden. They pointed out safe houses and jungle hideouts.
What's fascinating is that the records mention how terrified these informers were. Even if an informer was too afraid of LTTE retribution to physically accompany the military raiding party, which is totally understandable,
Yeah.
they didn't want to be seen pointing the finger. The information they verbally provided was almost always dead on.
Incredibly accurate, yeah.
It led to massive seizures of enemy material. So, Wham winning hearts and minds isn't just about being a nice guy. It is a highly calculated, ruthlessly effective intelligence-gathering mechanism.
Oh, yeah.
It's weaponized empathy. You treat people with dignity so they trust you enough to tell you where the roadside bombs are buried.
It is the perception battlefield. The physical battlefield is where you shoot bullets. The perception battlefield is where you win the war. And this ties directly into the psychological and information operations the IPKF was running. They understood they had to control the narrative environment, so they utilized every medium available. They beamed specially created TV programs and radio broadcasts into the area. They printed and distributed posters highlighting insurgent atrocities or promoting the return of civil order. They even printed their own newspapers.
Though it's worth noting the historical reality of information control in a conflict. We have to be impartial here, looking at the sources. The records show these newspapers were printed after necessary censorship. They weren't running op-eds criticizing the Indian government. They were tightly controlling the narrative.
Naturally. In a counterinsurgency, information is ammunition. You do not hand ammunition to your enemy. And right alongside this narrative control was the immense physical reality of refugee management, which was an operational necessity, not just a charity mission.
Because of the violence over the previous years, tens of thousands of Tamil refugees had fled across the Palk Strait, seeking shelter in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu.
And trying to convince them to return to Sri Lanka required immense persuasion. Many of these refugees had a mortal, deeply ingrained fear of retribution from the Sinhala ethnic majority or the Sri Lankan state forces. And frankly, on a practical level, some of them had just settled down, found jobs in India, and simply didn't want to uproot their lives again to return to a war-torn island.
The logistics of the return were massive. The Indian Navy literally deployed naval craft to transport refugees back across the water to places like Mannar. Once they landed, the International Red Cross and various UN agencies took over the heavy lifting, providing relief money, building materials for shelter, cooking utensils, clothing, and free food to help them restart their lives. But here is where we hit a fascinating anomaly in the historical accounting, a math mystery that reveals a lot about the covert side of the war.
Yes. When analysts look at the numbers from this period, there is a glaring discrepancy. The official records indicate that only about 60,000 refugees could actually be located, convinced to return, and processed back into Sri Lanka. Yet, the relief funds, the massive amounts of international money handled by those UN agencies and NGOs, were actively being claimed and paid out for a population of over 100,000 people.
So if I'm doing the math, we have 40,000 ghost refugees claiming international relief funds. Where did the money go? The official documents often leave it as an open question. But given what we just deduced about the LTTE siphoning food and antibiotics from the refugee camps earlier, it is highly probable, almost certain, that the insurgency was actively exploiting the international relief system.
Oh, absolutely.
They were creating fake identities or using the names of the dead to funnel millions of dollars of humanitarian aid directly into the insurgency's war chest.
It is a dark reality that highlights the extreme complexity of the operational environment. Every single humanitarian gesture, every dollar of aid, every bag of rice is vulnerable to insurgent exploitation.
So imagine the cognitive load on the IPKF commanders. You are managing this massive civil administration, you are running schools, you are gathering intelligence from terrified locals, you are broadcasting radio shows, and you're trying to stop the UN from accidentally funding the enemy. But while all that is happening, the physical pieces on the military board still have to move. The enemy is out there. They aren't in the city anymore. They are deep in the jungle. This brings us to the strategic redeployment.
To fight a rural, jungle-based insurgency in the dense Vani region, the IPKF had to undertake a massive logistical nightmare of a redeployment for its 80,000 personnel. They had to shift from a concentrated urban threat posture in the Jaffna Peninsula to a sprawling, highly decentralized footprint covering half the island.
The military divided the operational area into 4 distinct sectors, and they cleverly aligned these military sectors with the existing Sri Lankan civil administrative districts, which made it much easier for the military commanders to coordinate with whatever local government officials were still functioning. Let's help you, the listener, build a mental map of Sri Lanka to visualize this massive deployment. Imagine the classic teardrop shape of the island of Sri Lanka.
Right. We are going to anchor the 4 Indian Army divisions, which, by the way, were restructured into flexible combat groups to ensure every unit had a balanced mix of infantry, mechanized armor, and artillery to their specific geographic regions.
Okay, starting at the very top of the teardrop, the northern sector. This is the Jaffna Peninsula, the city they just captured.
That area of responsibility is given to the 54 Infantry Division. Their job was to hold the city, run the civil affairs we just discussed, and ensure the LTTE couldn't filter back into the urban center.
Moving down into the middle of the teardrop, the central sector, This is the Vani region, anchored around a town called Vavunia.
That became the responsibility of the newly inducted 4 Infantry Division. This was the heart of darkness. Dense, unforgiving jungle terrain where the core of the LTTE fighting force had retreated to establish their hidden bases.
Over on the right side of the teardrop, the eastern coast, centered around the strategic deep-water port city of Trincomalee.
That was the eastern sector, held by the 36th Infantry Division. They were responsible for a massive stretch of coastline and preventing maritime smuggling.
And finally, further down that eastern coastline, the southern sector, centered around Batticaloa.
Secured by the 57 Mountain Division. So if you step back and look at the map, you have a massive, heavily armed net cast over the entire northern and eastern half of the island nation. We are talking about 15 full brigades spread across 4 divisions.
But as any fisherman will tell you, casting a net doesn't mean you catch the fish, especially if the fish are armed with rocket-propelled grenades. The historical analysis goes into deep detail about the formidable capabilities of the LTTE during this phase. You weren't just a ragtag group of kids hiding behind bushes with old hunting rifles.
Not at all. They were arguably one of the most sophisticated, highly motivated insurgent forces in modern history. They utilized classic textbook hit-and-run tactics, relocating their main strike forces largely to the eastern province to stretch the IPKF lines. But what made them truly dangerous was their logistical backing. Intelligence sources from the time indicated they received a massive shipment of state-of-the-art arms, ammunition, and military-grade explosives from Singapore in September 1987, and another massive consignment arrived just months later in February 1988.
Wait, Singapore? Stop and think about what that implies. That means an insurgent group hiding in a jungle had international procurement networks, front companies, shipping vessels, and the tactical ability to secretly offload tons of explosives onto the Sri Lankan coastline right under the nose of the Indian Navy and 80,000 ground troops.
Their capabilities were staggering, and their communications network was equally impressive. The records note that the LTTE's electronic warfare capabilities were so good that they could often discover the exact real-time location of an Indian Army patrol simply by intercepting and monitoring the IPKF's own tactical communication networks.
Imagine the psychological toll that takes on a soldier. You are walking point through a dense, steaming, hostile jungle. You can't see 10 feet in front of you. And you know for a fact that the enemy is sitting in a bunker somewhere, listening to your radio chatter, plotting your exact coordinates on a map, and setting up an ambush right in your path.
It's terrifying. Now, the IPKF was intercepting LTTE messages too, which was an excellent source of counterintelligence. But the LTTE operators were incredibly savvy. The archives reveal that LTTE radio operators often figured out they were being listened to, and instead of going silent, they would deliberately broadcast false messages, fake coordinates, and phantom troop movements specifically to mislead the IPKF interceptors and draw Indian troops into traps. It was a high-stakes, lethal game of electronic cat-and-mouse played over the airwaves.
They also fundamentally changed how the IPKF had to build their physical defenses. The LTTE pioneered the use of devastating suicide vehicle attacks. They would pack a truck with explosives and drive it straight into an Indian Army camp. This forced the military to completely redesign their perimeters, installing heavy metal roadblocks, zigzag chicanes, and massive steel spikes at the entrances to physically prevent vehicles from ramming the gates.
But despite the suicide bombers and the radio intercepts, the greatest challenge, the fundamental, unsolvable problem of this entire phase of the war was identification. The sheer, terrifying difficulty of telling an active LTTE fighter apart from an ordinary Tamil civilian farmer or shopkeeper.
Right. They don't wear uniforms, they don't march in formation. So if you can't tell the enemy from the civilian, and the enemy is listening to your radios, while hiding in a jungle they have known since childhood and getting resupplied with high explosives from international waters, how do you even begin an offensive operation? You can't just carpet bomb the jungle. That violates every rule of winning hearts and minds.
You have to utilize a very specific, methodical counterinsurgency logic. You have to change the environment itself. And that leads us to the massive sequence of military maneuvers designed to break the stalemate.
Let's lay out the classic counterinsurgency logic framework for the listener. Military strategists often summarize the required progression of actions into 5 steps. Find, fix, isolate, neutralize, and rehabilitate.
It is a sequential chain. Let's walk through it. First, you have to find the insurgent. You can't do that from the air. It requires human intelligence, which comes from the WAM operations, the grievance cells, and the surrendered prisoners we talked about. Once you know where they are, you have to fix them in the specific location, engaging them so they cannot easily escape.
Right. Keep them pinned.
Then, crucially, and this is the hardest part, you must isolate them.
And the military devised a very specific population isolation strategy. How did the IPKF actually attempt to isolate insurgents across entire sprawling jungle provinces?
Because it was impossible to identify insurgents when they were mixed in with the population in the towns and villages, the IPKF commanders decided they had to clear areas in a methodical way that physically prevented the LTTE from filtering back in. The strategy was to operate from the outer flanks of each province and slowly, deliberately move inwards. They would clear a swath of territory and then keep it sterile by sealing it behind them with rings of troops' cordons.
Step by step, like drawing a massive net tighter and tighter.
Exactly. By pushing from the flanks inward, they slowly but surely drove the active LTTE fighting cadres away from the populated towns and villages, pushing them deeper and deeper into the uninhabitable center of the Vanni jungles. They were physically surrounding the jungle canopy. The strategic goal was total isolation.
You are forcibly separating the insurgent from their lifeblood. You cut them off from the people they recruit from, the resources they steal, the information they gather, and you restrict their freedom of movement. Now, the historical analysis mentions that in a shorter time frame, a classic brutal counterinsurgency tactic might involve forcibly grouping villages, taking thousands of civilians and moving them into fortified guarded hamlets to completely isolate the insurgents. This was done in Malaya by the British and attempted in Vietnam with the Strategic Hamlet Program.
Yes, but the IPKF commanders explicitly rejected that approach. Moving entire populations into internment camps is historically incredibly controversial. It breeds deep generational resentment, destroys the local economy, and costs a fortune to manage. It ruins the political front. So instead of moving the people, the IPKF relied on massive, highly coordinated troop movements to sweep and seal the terrain itself. And this doctrine resulted in a relentless sequence of massive military operations from early 1988 straight through into 1989.
Let's construct an easy recall story, a mental timeline for the listener to track these major operations, because the sheer scale is hard to grasp. We'll chronologically sweep through them. The counteroffensive truly begins in February 1988, down in the southern sector, around Batacaloa.
That was Operation Swordfish, February 1988. The tactical aim was straightforward. Conduct deep search and destroy missions to locate and eliminate LTTE jungle camps. The outcome was highly successful. It disrupted the insurgent networks, helped the IPKF secure the immediate Batacaloa district, and, importantly, the professionalism of the troops during the sweep helped gain a measure of public acceptance.
Then, the very next month, March 1988, also in the Batacaloa sector, things escalate dramatically. Operation Blooming Tulip.
This was a massive, complex undertaking. Intelligence had revealed that the LTTE had established their largest, most fortified base in the entire Batacaloa district. It was a sprawling, entrenched stronghold that the insurgents confidently referred to as Beirut. This complex covered an area encompassing over 30 villages. Operation Blooming Tulip was launched to completely surround and systematically flush the LTTE out of this massive complex. It involved intense close-quarters jungle fighting, but it succeeded in breaking the Beirut stronghold.
Imagine a fortified jungle base spanning 30 villages. The scale is just wild. Then in April 1988, the focus shifts north. Operation Trucial. This was a sweeping operation covering a huge swath of geography: Elephant Pass, Manar, Molotivu, and Vavunia, a massive dragnet to search and destroy strongholds in the central and northern areas.
And Operation Trucial rolled almost immediately into one of the largest, most significant efforts of the entire war, Operation Virat, also launched in April 1988, focusing on the northern province and the deep Vanni jungles. To understand Operation Virat, you have to understand the commitment of force. This operation involved approximately 15,000 Indian troops.
15,000 troops. Let's just pause on that. That is an entire army division plunging into triple canopy jungle simultaneously. You've got armored columns trying to navigate dirt tracks, paratroopers dropping in to seal escape routes, infantry hacking through the brush, and army aviation helicopters providing fire support and medical evacuation overhead.
The logistics of simply feeding and supplying 15,000 men in that terrain is a marvel of military planning. But what they found during Operation Virat is what truly shocked the commanders. The intelligence assumption was that they were hunting guerrillas living in tents and caves. But deep in the jungle canopy, the IPKF uncovered incredibly elaborate, well-prepared LTTE defensive positions. We are talking about massive reinforced concrete bunkers.
Concrete, in the middle of an trackless jungle. How do you even get cement mixers and steel rebar out there without anyone noticing?
It speaks to years of preparation and an incredibly disciplined, invisible logistics chain. And it wasn't just concrete. These underground complexes were equipped with heavy electrical generators to run lights, radios, and ventilation. They found massive, waterproofed caches of arms, ammunition, and medical reserves. The LTTE had built subterranean fortresses, and digging them out resulted in intense, brutal, unconventional warfare. The records note that the IPKF suffered significant casualties during Virat as the LTTE utilized the terrain perfectly, frequently ambushing the slow-moving Indian convoys and infantry patrols from hidden spider holes and elevated tree platforms.
Yeah, it's a grinding, bloody slog.
Yeah.
Then in June 1988, they launched Operation Checkmate up in the Vadamarachi area.
The aim of Checkmate was highly specific, and it perfectly illustrates the intersection of the military and political fronts. It was initiated immediately prior to the planned democratic elections. The LTTE, knowing that successful elections would legitimize the government and undermine their claim to power, had threatened violence and called for a total boycott of the vote. Checkmate was designed strictly to aggressively hunt down LTTE strike teams and destroy the Tiger's capacity to hinder that electoral process.
And jumping ahead a bit on the timeline to July 1989, back down in Batticaloa, there is Operation Tufan. And the political context for this operation is absolutely wild.
Operation Tufan was tactically carried out to destroy a newly established LTTE stronghold. But the strategic backdrop is what makes it infamous. By July 1989, the political winds had shifted so drastically that the Sri Lankan government, the very government that had originally invited the Indian peacekeeping force into the country to fight the LTTE, was actually secretly arming the LTTE against the IPKF.
I mean, you can't write fiction like that. The government is arming the insurgents to shoot at the peacekeepers who are there to protect the government from the insurgents. We will absolutely dig into how that political friction happened in a moment. But these major operations, Swordfish, Blooming Tulip, Trishul, Virat, Checkmate, Tufan, plus dozens of smaller ones like Fajra, Sword Edge, and Baaz, represent a relentless, exhausting operational tempo.
And we shouldn't view these just as arrows on a strategic map. The historical accounts ground these operations with specific, visceral human encounters. For instance, in the Jaffna sector, during a fierce engagement, Major Pramaswaran of the 8th Maha Regiment made the supreme sacrifice. He was posthumously awarded India's highest military decoration, the Param Vir Chakra, for his extraordinary bravery in overcoming heavy LTTE opposition in close combat.
And there's another detail from the archives that reads like a tense cinematic thriller. An operation on the west coast of the Jaffna Peninsula in a place called Mulai.
Yes. The IPKF intelligence branch had secured a confirmed, highly credible tip on the exact physical location of the LTTE's supreme leader, Malupalaya Prabhakaran. Capturing or killing him would likely have ended the insurgency overnight. The IPKF deployed their elite paracommandos, launching a daring, silent, amphibious raid from the sea in the dead of night to hit the compound.
But they missed him.
By a hair's breadth. The commandos hit the beach in advance, but they unexpectedly ran into a hidden LTTE screening element, essentially an outer ring of bodyguards. A fierce firefight broke out in the dark. That delay, those few minutes of unexpected combat, provided Prabhakaran with just enough warning and time to slip out the back of the compound and escape deep into the jungle.
A hair's breadth. You wouldn't give the butterfly effect of that night. If that amphibious raid succeeds and they capture him, the entire history of the conflict, the subsequent decades of civil war in Sri Lanka, it all changes that day. But all of these kinetic operations, the sweeping, the isolating, the bunker clearing, they were all ultimately driving toward one singular non-military objective, creating the conditions for the political end state. Which brings us to the culmination of the two-front war and the incredible friction of reality.
Because, as we established in the first minute of this deep dive, military victory alone doesn't end the conflict. You need a political solution to fill the vacuum. And the culmination of all that military effort, the thousands of casualties, the millions of dollars spent, and the massive civil administration effort was the democratic elections of November 1988.
The IPKF's mandate was to assist the government of Sri Lanka in safely conducting these elections in the deeply contested northern and eastern provinces. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. The LTTE had publicly threatened to assassinate anyone who ran for office and anyone who dared to vote. They demanded a total boycott. But the IPKF, through operations like Checkmate, secured the polling stations, protected the candidates, and ensured the environment was stable enough that the elections actually went forward without massive LTTE disruption.
And the result was an absolute triumph for the counterinsurgency strategy. Against all odds and under the threat of death, they achieved an incredible 60% voter turnout.
Let's just pause and reflect on that number, 60%, in a brutal, active war zone, with heavily armed insurgents promising violence against voters. That turnout isn't just a statistic. It is a massive, undeniable validation of the security provided by the troops and the trust built by the civil affairs teams. The population believed in the process more than they feared the LTTE.
It provided absolute, unassailable political legitimacy to the process. Consequently, following the vote, the northern and eastern provinces were legally merged into one entity, the Northeastern Province, or NEP, through the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution. This was the political compromise the Tamils had been fighting for. A Tamil chief minister, a man named Varadaraj Perumal, representing the EPRLF party, a rival Tamil faction to the LTTE that had embraced the political process, was officially sworn into power by the Sri Lankan president, J.R. Jayewardene.
The historical analysts note that at this specific moment in late 1988, for all practical purposes, the IPKF had accomplished their mission. They had looted the insurgents conventionally, they had restored civil order, and they had successfully initiated the democratic process. The Indian government asked the military to stay deployed just a little longer, solely to help the fragile new provincial government establish firm roots. It's all like a textbook miraculous success story. The two-front war worked, but then the geopolitical tectonic plates shift.
Yeah.
Here comes the reversal.
This is the tragic reality of war. Military action always happens inside political boundaries, and political winds change faster than armies can march. In January 1989, a new president was elected in Sri Lanka, Ranasinghe Premadasa, and President Premadasa was vehemently anti-accord. He had deeply opposed the original international agreement that brought the Indian peacekeepers to Sri Lankan soil in the first place. He viewed them as an occupying foreign army.
So imagine you are the newly elected Tamil Chief Minister, Varadaraj Perumal. You stuck your neck out, you defied the LTTE, you embraced the peace accord, and suddenly you look at the capital. And the new president of the entire country is fundamentally hostile to the agreement that gives you your power. The political promises you relied on are evaporating. You realize there might not be a future for your people within the state after all.
Exactly. Panic sets in. The newly elected chief minister, Varadaraj Perumal, reacts to this hostility by making a drastic, fatal political miscalculation. He moves a motion in his provincial council to formally declare an independent, sovereign state of Tamilam.
Which is the exact, literal outcome the Sri Lankan state had spent years fighting a civil war to prevent.
Exactly. It gave President Premadasa all the justification he needed. He immediately responded by imposing direct president's rule, legally dissolving the provincial power structure, and effectively erasing the entire political victory the IPKF had bled to achieve. That centralized, dissolved state of affairs would last for nearly 2 decades, until 2006.
And remember Operation Tufan. This is the exact backdrop where the Sri Lankan government under President Premadasa actually started secretly funneling weapons and ammunition to the LTTE. The government's logic was, we hate the LTTE, but we hate the Indian army occupying our country even more. Let's arm the insurgents so they can bleed the Indians and force them to leave.
It is a stunning, breathtaking collapse of political synergy. The military had done the impossible. They secured the ground, they rebuilt the city, the elections happened, but the geopolitical reality completely unraveled the victory from above.
Which brings us to perhaps the most severe obstacles and constraints outlined in the historical record. The absolute friction of reality. And the most shocking part of this entire analysis isn't the Sri Lankan political betrayal. It's the external support the insurgents were receiving, support coming directly from India itself.
This is a crucial lesson for any counterinsurgency analyst to absorb the impossible task of managing external sanctuaries. The historical texts state plainly, as a matter of undeniable fact, that the Tamil Nadu government, which is a state government within the sovereign nation of India, located just across the water from Sri Lanka, have been providing the LTTE with massive financial assistance, training camps, and safe havens for hospitalization.
Let's be very clear about the absurdity of this situation. The National Indian Army is actively fighting, bleeding, and dying against the LTTE in the jungles of Sri Lanka. Meanwhile, an Indian state government is actively funding, sheltering, and patching up the very fighters killing Indian soldiers.
The official records provide incredible, impartial facts detailing these incidents, and we need to list them because the complexity is staggering and highlights why the military front was so difficult.
Incident 1. In January 1988, a law enforcement customs team intercepted a truck right outside Madras in Tamil Nadu. The truck is carrying known LTTE personnel, and it is loaded with military weapons, ammunition, and high explosives.
But instead of arresting them, the customs team receives orders from higher up to simply impound the weapons and let the LTTE men walk away freely into the city.
Incident 2. An IPKF patrol deep in the Sri Lankan jungle recovers a cache of cordite, a specific type of explosive propellant used in artillery and bombs. The intelligence officers trace its manufacturing origin. It hadn't come from a jungle lab. It had been officially manufactured at an explosives plant near Wellington in Coonoor, India, in October 1987.
Incident 3. The LTTE wasn't just hiding in the Indian state. They were actively operating numerous, highly sophisticated radio transmission stations along the coast of Tamil Nadu. When the Indian National Intelligence finally raided one of these stations, they recovered Allied military equipment and advanced books on electronics. The insurgents were using Indian soil as an unbreakable, untouchable rear base for their command and control communications.
Incident 4. The historical analysis even flashes back to 1982 to show how deep this protection ran. Years before the IPKF deployment, Prabhakaran, the supreme leader of the LTTE, engaged in a literal shootout, ambushing a rival militant in a crowded street in Madras. The local police arrested him, but the records indicate they were pressured to release him on bail, reportedly on the direct, unofficial orders of the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu.
There were widespread, credible reports that LTTE casualties were routinely being loaded onto boats, smuggled across the strait from the Sri Lankan battlefield, and brought directly into Tamil Nadu for advanced medical treatment in Indian hospitals. And to put a final, bitter cap on this dynamic, years later, when the IPKF finally completed their withdrawal and the returning Indian soldiers disembarked at the port in Chennai, India, the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu at the time, Mr. K. Karunanidhi, deliberately abstained from attending the official welcoming ceremony.
The psychological toll on the average Indian soldier must have been devastating. You are fighting an enemy that is receiving logistical support, medical care, explosive propellant, and political top cover from your own country's territory. It makes the military task functionally impossible.
And compounding this external friction was a fatal lack of strategic rapport at the absolute highest levels of the Indian government itself. The historical text details a specific moment when the relentless military pressure of operations like Virat actually worked. The LTTE was hurting. They secretly sent ceasefire feelers through a proxy intermediary, a man named Mr. Balakumar.
So the LTTE is reaching out, saying, okay, let's talk. How did the leadership respond?
This is where the fracture happened. The military commanders on the ground in Sri Lanka, the generals who were reading the daily intelligence and seeing the casualty reports, assessed that while the LTTE was indeed hurting, they were still tactically flexible and capable. The military interpretation was, this is a ploy for time, we have them on the ropes, we need to turn the screws some more, apply maximum pressure now, and force an unconditional surrender.
But the diplomats back in New Delhi, the Ministry of External Affairs and the intelligence agencies operating out of Colombo, interpreted the signal entirely differently. Their assessment was that the LTTE was on the verge of total, imminent collapse, and that it was the perfect moment to immediately halt military operations and begin diplomatic talks.
The ground commander frantically tried to inform Army headquarters in Delhi that the diplomatic assessment was factually, dangerously wrong. But the Army's view couldn't prevail in the capital. Why? The historical analysis explicitly points to a fatal breakdown in communication, a likely lack of personal rapport between the Chief of Army Staff and the Prime Minister of India at the time. The analysis summarizes it perfectly, noting that a lack of rapport between the military chief and the head of state, while undesirable in normal times, is completely fatal during an emergency.
Because that breakdown in communication essentially forced a pause that gave the insurgency exactly what it needed: breathing room. They rested, rearmed, and the war ground on.
And that institutional opacity, that breakdown in communication, extended forcefully into how the military handled public relations, which was, strategically speaking, a massive self-inflicted wound.
Yes, the media environment. The IPKF command enforced incredibly strict draconian censorship rules. They absolutely forbade Indian press persons and journalists from visiting the forward areas where the actual fighting was taking place.
Now, from a purely tactical security standpoint, if you're a battalion commander, you understand why a military does that. You don't want a reporter accidentally broadcasting your troop positions or photographing your defensive perimeters. But strategically, in a counterinsurgency where perception is reality, it was a disaster. By locking out the press, they deeply alienated the Indian media establishment.
And journalists are naturally suspicious of closed doors. Because they couldn't get official access or escorts from the IPKF, the more intrepid, aggressive reporters found another way in. They actually contacted LTTE sympathizers, had themselves covertly smuggled across the water into the Jaffna Peninsula, and ended up seeing and reporting on the fighting entirely from the insurgent side of the lines.
By trying to control the information completely, the IPKF unwittingly handed the entire narrative over to the enemy. The historical texts note that the foreign international press remained largely impartial, trying to report the facts. But because the IPKF was a black box providing no information, even the impartial foreign journalists would end up picking up and publishing LTTE-provided handouts and press releases simply because there's an information vacuum and they had to print something.
Information dominance is critical, and opacity deeply hurt the IPKF's cause. By the time the military leadership realized they needed more openness with the press to project factual positions, dispel wild rumors of atrocities, and explain the complexity of their mission, the narrative war was already largely lost.
Finally, to truly grasp the scale of this phase, we must briefly look at the unglamorous backbone of the entire endeavor: administration and logistics. The sheer operational endurance required to sustain this force in a hostile, austere environment.
Right. We keep saying 80,000 troops.
Right.
Think about the calories alone. You have to move heavy stores, ammunition, medical supplies, and food from the deep-water seaport at Trincomalee, haul it overland by road through hostile territory to the choke point at Elephant Pass, just to supply the troops holding Jaffna in the north.
You have to manage complex casualty evacuation chains with alacrity. A soldier wounded in a jungle ambush needs helicopter extraction, field stabilization, and transport to a major hospital, providing appropriate surgical treatment at every stage. And then there is the deeply somber, morale-defining logistics of war, making every conceivable effort to recover and transport the mortal remains of deceased soldiers back across the ocean to India so their families can perform their last rites. Though tragically, the adverse jungle conditions and the intensity of combat sometimes made that impossible.
It is a massive, grinding, multi-billion-dollar machine that requires constant fuel, both literal diesel and administrative oversight. The records note how strained the command structure was. For example, during the incredibly chaotic initial phase of the deployment, the overall commander was juggling multiple massive roles. His chief of staff, the guy supposed to be running the daily war, was simultaneously holding the position of the Director General of Military Intelligence based hundreds of miles away in Delhi.
The historical analysis points out that this absurd dual-hatting left the Military Intelligence Directorate functionally headless at the exact crucial time when actionable intelligence was desperately needed to prevent ambushes. It was unsustainable. Eventually, the military bureaucracy caught up to reality. They had to establish a formal, dedicated, full-fledged IPKF headquarters on April 1st, 1988, to handle the immense scale of the operation. They even had to create and post a specific brigadier-level officer just to handle the sprawling civil affairs portfolio.
All of this, the logistics, the press relations, the civil administration, the political betrayal, highlights the central humbling lesson of this entire analysis. Kinetic combat, the actual shooting of rifles, is only a tiny fraction of warfare. Sustainment, administration, and political alignment are the gears that actually achieve the mission.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of historical ground. We've navigated the jungles, the politics, and the logistics. Let's pull all this together into a final, comprehensive strategic assessment. We want to arm you, the listener, with the tools to remember the core lessons of this masterclass in counterinsurgency. So looking at this entire campaign, what is the ultimate strategic assessment here? What went right?
What went right was the sheer institutional adaptability of the military force on the ground. They took a massive army trained to fight tank battles on open plains and rapidly transitioned them into a counterinsurgency force capable of operating in dense jungles. Their success in civil administration, literally rebuilding the city of Jaffna from scratch, restoring power, holding exams, was a monumental, underappreciated achievement. The Wham initiative, specifically the highly disciplined, humane treatment of prisoners that shattered insurgent propaganda and led to a flood of actionable human intelligence, was highly effective. And from a purely operational standpoint, securing a hostile environment well enough to achieve a 60% voter turnout in the 1988 democratic elections was a definitive textbook success.
And the other side of the coin, what failed or what could be improved?
The failures, tragically, were largely outside the tactical control of the military commanders on the ground. The lack of political synergy was fatal. The reversal by the new Sri Lankan president, who dissolved the political solution, combined with the severe breakdown in strategic communication between the Indian Army chief and the prime minister, created an unsolvable political vacuum. Furthermore, the utter failure to manage external sanctuaries, specifically allowing the LTTE to maintain a massive logistical, medical, and financial support base in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, made the insurgency functionally unkillable. You cannot bail out a sinking boat if someone else is actively pouring water back in. And finally, the draconian media censorship alienated the press, surrendered the narrative, and lost the IPKF the crucial perception war. The ultimate lesson is that military success absolutely requires unshakable political synergy and total information dominance.
Let's transition into a reflective summary. If you are a listener prepping for a briefing, or you just want to deeply cement this knowledge so you can explain it to a friend, let's rapidly discuss the 5 key analytical takeaways from our deep dive today. Let's start with number 1, the challenges of the counterinsurgency phase.
If you're analyzing the challenges, your main factors are the violent shift from urban conventional warfare to rural jumble hit-and-run tactics. Add to that the severe agonizing difficulty of identifying insurgents from innocent civilians, and cap it off with the compounding fatal factor of external logistical support providing the enemy with endless resources.
Number 2, the role of civil affairs as a weapon.
Focus entirely on the governance vacuum left by the retreating LTTE. Recall the story of Brigadier Kalan stepping in as the town commandant of a ruined city. Understand that restoring utilities, delivering food, and holding high school exams weren't just random humanitarian acts. They were calculated, strategic tools designed to deny the insurgency a psychological foothold in the population.
Number 3, the true mechanics of winning hearts and minds.
The key mechanism here is the prisoner rehabilitation strategy. Humane treatment, vocational training, and family visits shattered the insurgents' internal propaganda. This led to family-induced surrenders. Combine that with the creation of grievance cells, and you show how building trust transforms a terrified population into a massive, willing intelligence-gathering asset.
Number 4, the doctrinal transition from conventional operations to insurgency.
This is all about Clausewitz and the center of gravity shift. Conventional warfare targets the enemy's physical army. Insurgency targets the minds of the population. Grasp the shift from fighting over fixed geographical positions to fighting the conceptual two-front war, applying relentless military pressure while simultaneously forging political negotiation.
And finally, number 5, the ultimate lessons learned from the insurgency phase.
The ultimate enduring lesson. Military action only buys time for a political solution. If you lack political synergy at the highest levels, or if you lose information dominance through media opacity and censorship, no amount of tactical military victories, no matter how bravely fought, will ever end the conflict.
Perfect. Now, to wrap this up, let's build your final 1-page mental memory sheet. If you only remember 3 bullet points from this entire hour of deep history, lock these into your brain. First, the timeline. Late 1987 is the capture of Jaffna and the immediate jarring shift to insurgency warfare. The spring of 1988 sees the launch of massive, sweeping jungle operations like Virat and Blooming Tulip to isolate the enemy, and November 1988 is the culmination point, the successful democratic elections.
Second, the locations. Just remember the teardrop map and the 4 sectors. Northern is Jaffna, the urban center. Central is Vavunia in the dense Vani jungles. Eastern is the port of Trincomalee. Southern is Batacaloa.
And third, the key figures. Think of Brigadier Kalan, the soldier suddenly tasked with running a city of 1 million people. Think of Major Parameswaran, representing the supreme sacrifice of the troops in the jungle. And think of Varadaraj Perumal, the Tamil chief minister whose brave election was the absolute peak of the political effort, and whose desperate declaration of an independent Elam signaled its tragic reversal.
If you hold on to those core concepts, the center of gravity shift, the necessity of the two-front war, and the fatal friction of external politics, you will fundamentally understand the complex anatomy of any counterinsurgency.
I want to thank you, the listener, for taking this deep dive with us today into a profoundly complex, often overlooked chapter of military history. We've explored an immense landscape together, from repairing 4,000-line telephone exchanges and intercepting jungle radios, to daring amphibious raids and heartbreaking geopolitical betrayals. But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder on your own. We started this hour by talking about how an insurgency breaks the clean binary rules of a conventional chess match. We saw how a highly trained army had to instantly put down their heavy weapons and become municipal administrators, teachers, mechanics, and politicians just to win over the population. So consider this. As warfare continues to evolve, and the line between civilian and combatant blurs even further. If a military's ultimate goal in counterinsurgency is to successfully replace itself with a functioning local civil government, does that mean the perfect soldier in the 21st century needs to be as much a mayor, a diplomat, and a social worker as they are a fighter?
It is a profound question that completely redefines what victory actually looks like.
Until next time, keep diving deep.